Welcome to the RECO12 speaker meeting. We are an organization whose addictions include alcohol, drugs, lust and sex, food, and gambling, just to name a few. We come together from all places, faiths, and backgrounds to learn the similarities of addiction and to gain tools and hope from others who are walking a similar path. We invite recovering addicts with at least 1 year sobriety who are actively working their recovery in their respective fellowships to share their experience, strength, and hope on a live Zoom meeting each Friday at noon Central Time for 20 to 25 minutes. Then we, the live audience, get the opportunity to ask questions of the speaker for another 20 to 25 minutes. In order to ask questions, please type them in the Q&A link at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you're hearing this podcast recorded and would like to participate as a live audience member in the future, or if you'd like to be a guest speaker in a future meeting, please go to RECO12.com, that's RECO12.com, to learn more and submit your email address there to receive weekly invitations or to submit to become a guest speaker. RECO12 is an ad-free service, and we appreciate your help in keeping it that way. We gratefully accept contributions to help cover the cost of the Zoom platform, podcast platform, web hosting, and administrative costs. To contribute, you can go to RECO12.com/support, or you can click the link to PayPal in the chat of the live meeting, or if you use Venmo, you can also contribute there. Our handle is at RECO-12, TWELVE. When you contribute, please specify the meeting number. This meeting is number 15, and I'll also put the link to the PayPal and those things in the show notes for those listening in the podcast. Last week's meeting with Dr. Benjamin Hardy was a great one, and I got some good feedback from people who had some potential course-altering insights from it. If you missed hearing that one, or any other meeting we have done, you can listen to them in podcast form by searching for RECO12 Speaker Meeting Podcast on virtually any podcast platform that you use, or you can go to RECO12 website and find it under the link podcast. Now, let's introduce our guest speaker for today, Blake M. Blake is a recovering sexaholic and has been sober for over 2 years. Blake started working his recovery 7 years ago, and today he's going to talk to us on his journey of childhood trauma and abuse and its effect on his relationship with God. Take it away, Blake. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Justin. I feel overwhelmed. Sometimes I feel inadequate about what I have to offer anybody that they would, invite me to one of these meetings just to talk. And but I do feel strongly about, my childhood trauma and its effect on my connection with God, or lack thereof, as I look back on my life. And today's, a lot of the trauma that I'm going to talk about today. I was lying in bed one night and all of a sudden I had this thought about giving a talk. And I was trying to figure out what on earth I would give a talk about. And these childhood traumas started coming up in my head, and this narrative unfolded. I felt God handing me this, and I don't know why, but I got out of bed and I started writing it. And I would hope that by sharing some of these painful memories and vulnerable memories, that at least somebody that listens to this, it leads to a greater understanding of how your actions can affect your kids and their relationship with God. And a lot of this comes from step 2, working step 2. I remember looking in the Step Into Action book and reading the exercise. And I remember thinking, this is really stupid. And it talked about an authority figure and what you learned from that authority figure. And I said, hey, I'm just going to do this. I'm just going to put my faith in this book and in the program, and I'm just going to do it. And I made my chart, and I was quite literally blown away as pieces of my childhood started to make sense to me. And I realized why I didn't have a relationship with God. And I realized what I'd learned from these authority figures. And I remember as a kid, I was probably 5 or 6. And I remember carrying a chair up the stairs. And I hit the wall with the foot of the chair, and it put a ding in the wall. And I didn't say anything. And thinking back, I felt fear and ashamed and scared that I'd done something wrong. And the next day, as the family was climbing the stairs, because the way that house was is the garage let in and we had to climb the stairs. Dad saw the ding and he instantly got mad. Who dinged the wall? And he was just yelling it. And there was no way I was owning up to that anger. Not me, I said, shaking my head. I learned that day that if I made a mistake, the only safe thing to do was to lie. About the same time, I remember being out in a sandbox that Dad built. And that was a good memory, having Dad actually, build a sandbox. I had a rock, and I was pretending it was a rocket. And I blasted off the rocket, and I threw the rock into the air, except it went through the basement bathroom window. And the next day, when Dad saw it, instant anger, 0 to 10 in 2 seconds. Nope, no idea how it got broken. If you made a mistake, Dad would be angry, and the only safe thing to do would be lie to be perfect. And then I remember taking piano lessons, and I was actually pretty good. As I liked my hand-eye coordination was pretty good. And I remember, enjoying it and liking to learn really difficult pieces that were really fast. And I remember my first recital. Mom and Dad were both there. And I remember how excited I was when I finished. And I'm beaming. I told my dad I played it perfect. And I remember his response as though it was yesterday. Not perfect. You did hit a couple of keys together. And to this day, I can feel how crushing that statement was. I don't believe I hit 2 keys together. In my mind, I did play it perfectly. But the crushing weight of that statement is still overwhelming. I would never be good enough. How could I be good enough? I played it perfectly, and he still couldn't admit that I had. I didn't share any of my successes or victories, or really any of my life with my parents after that. I was on my own. And as you can guess, I quit piano shortly after that recital. And looking back, I can never, not once, remember having a real discussion with my parents. And let that sink in. Not one vulnerable, honest discussion. Not then or for the next 30 years. Around 12 years old, I found a couple of baseball mitts in the closet. And I'm thinking to myself, baseball mitts. Well, I have 3 older brothers and 2 younger sisters, and I realized I never got to play baseball. But my brothers did. And I felt empty. I felt empty, like I didn't matter. And I came to realize that, as my mom and dad, they were rarely, Dad was really not involved in our lives. He was a workaholic, and I call him a scriptureholic because he just loved to read the scriptures. But my mom had already done the boy things. Right? 3 older brothers. Baseball was one of those things. By the time I was growing up, Mom had 2 younger sisters to dote on and new things and new experiences to do. And I just felt lost. So I get to high school and I decide I want to wrestle. I'm going to wrestle on the high school team. This is the first sport that I'd ever belonged to. And those workouts were tough. I'd never done anything physical, and the difference between myself and those that had played football, except they were clearly apparent. I mean, these guys were in shape, and I was like, man, this is the first thing I've ever done. Well, the wrestling meets came and went, and mom or dad or my brothers never came to any of my meets. And I remember one night I had a meet, and I was getting ready to go to high school. And Dad asked where I was going, and I said I had a wrestling match that night, and he could come. And he said, how much is it to get in? And I replied, I think it's $5. And then he moans, why do they have to charge to get into the meets? And I quickly said, hey, it's no big deal. You should just stay home. And he never saw me wrestle. But I learned that day I wasn't worth $5 or his time. So I challenge you to ask yourself, what godlike traits am I teaching my kids? Anger, judgment, not worth your time or money, selfishness? You see, I put every one of these traits on God as a kid growing up. Dad was the authority figure in my life growing up, and I learned very young that if I made a mistake, he'll be angry. That if I lie, I don't get in trouble. that I would never be good enough, and that I wasn't worth $5 or his time. Why in the hell would I reach out to a God with those traits? How could I have a real conversation with God when I'd never had a real conversation with anyone? I relied on me and only me. How can a child understand God's compassion when he's never felt compassion? How can a child understand that God loves us no matter what, when every time we make a mistake, there's only anger? And if you always feel judged, why would you reach out to God? If you've never felt love, how can you understand God's love for you? You know, for a minute, I'd like everyone to close your eyes and think back to your 5-year-old self or your 10-year-old self, and think about a childhood trauma and how your parents or authority figure responded to it. Now, imagine instead of dad yelling and getting angry for dinging the wall, imagine your authority figure seeing the ding and looking around and seeing me and seeing my pain and the failure and the shame in my eyes. And instead of getting angry, he comes over and hugs me. Says, "It's okay. We all make mistakes, and I love you anyway." For that is God hugging me and telling me that he loves me and that I'm enough. You know, that's all I ever wanted, is to be loved and accepted. Why did it take me 52 years to understand that I could find that in God? You can open your eyes now. You know, I was 52 years old, meeting with a therapist specializing in sexual addiction, that the realization that God did not have my father's face hit me. I've had to really work at letting God into my life. And step 2 was a game changer for me. It's not easy for me to reach out to people or my sponsor or God. I've been doing things on my own for a long time, but the 12 steps have helped me deal with my childhood trauma. You know, it's, you know, with that trauma growing up in my religion, and God was always Heavenly Father. And there's so much trauma and memories associated with that, that when I did step 2, I can only call God God. But he still hears me and he still answers me. And I didn't realize how impactful a name could be. It's going to be emotional, right? Excuse me. So, my stepson, who I adopted, I married his mom 12 years, almost 13 years ago. And so he's 22 now. And so I've been the authority figure in his life. And his dad has been almost non-existent. But I got a Father's Day card. And I want to read it. And it's hard. They call me Pops. And I never understood why. Why Pops? And he says, "I don't think I will ever call you my dad. It's a title that you don't want from me. I don't associate good feelings with that name. And I feel like it would be an insult to call you what wasn't there for me." most of my childhood. A name who I once called Dad pulled me off of a school bus in the 6th grade. I don't associate anything good with that name. I appreciate your adoption of me more than you could ever know. It has allowed me to come to terms with what has happened in the past, and I'm able to move forward. Appreciate everything you've done for me, school, car, another car, housing, and everything in between. My ex-dad is someone who gave me nail clippers as a Christmas gift. My pops is someone who cared about my life. I've invested so much into my future, and I love you for that. So I get higher power. I get that you can call God whatever you want, whatever you need to. And I look back and I wonder, what trauma have I caused my kids? And what are they going to put upon God? And how are they going to be able to reach out to God if it's just an angry God that has no compassion or love? And I don't know that we realize what trauma we cause our kids with our shortcomings. But I know it's important. I know it's important that we get our lives in order and we start thinking, is this how God would respond? And what do I want my kids' relationship to God to be? And if I don't model that, if I don't learn to have a discussion with them and talk to them and hear them and have it feel non-judgmental, where are they going to end up? They're going to end up as addicts. I just was, and that's how I became an addict. I was lonely. I so much wanted to be accepted and loved. And there was a couple in the ward, and they were just awesome. Man, all the kids would go over there after school. They'd do homework. And in fact, he's the reason that several of the kids graduated high school. Great guy. And, but eventually his, I'd go over there every day after school and I'd hang out till dinner. And, just the kids would come over and go. And there was always, I don't know, anywhere from 3 to 7 or 8 kids always over there. And I loved the attention, but, it was only a matter of time. And eventually, I started having sex with his wife. Or that's what I thought at the time. Looking back, she was having sex with me. She seduced me. I'm only 16 years old. I wasn't capable of making that decision. It's like someone giving you cocaine without knowing it. And after you're hooked, you start asking for it. She was 33. And we had sex daily, for well over a year, every day. You can't put that cat back in the bag. And, oh yeah, I'm now a sex addict. And I'm angry about it. I'm angry that she stole my virginity. Angry that she fed me heroin, sex, daily. That she took away that most innocent experience of dating and intimacy. And I'm angry that she destroyed my ability to look at sex as a loving, connecting act and turn it into an addiction. And I was not able to choose things in high school that I should have been able to choose. Wrestling my junior year or going to her house for sex. I couldn't turn it off. I was no longer free to choose. What's really messed up is my church blames me. Her husband blames me. Her father even called me one time and asked if I was messing around with his daughter. I'm like, really? You call a 17-year-old kid like it's my fault that we're having sex instead of calling your daughter. And her husband tells me one day that it's really hard to come home from work and see me lying with his wife. And I'm thinking, what the hell's going on here? The 17-year-old kid is at fault, not the 34-year-old woman? I understand completely why people that have been abused think it's their fault, and it's messed up. And even my church, when I told my bishop, blame me. And I met with him twice. That's it. And that was the only person I ever told about that experience until I was 40 and told my current wife about it. I held that in for 20 years. Is it any wonder that I stayed a sex addict? You know, I find this, you know, and I my wife completely supported me in recovery. She knew my story before she married me. She knew everything about me. I was tired of being a fake. I was tired of having to pretend to be perfect. I just wanted to be me. And so I told her everything about me. But in closing, I wrote a prayer, and it says, God, grant me the courage to face the pain I caused my wife. Grant me the courage to face my addiction and do hard things to overcome it. Grant me the courage to find hope and faith and strength in thee. Grant me the courage to make phone calls when it's dark in my soul. Grant me courage to look inside myself, face and identify my weaknesses. God, grant me the courage to find the faith I need to turn my defects over to you that I might overcome them. God, let me feel the love from you that I've always been seeking in the wrong places. And finally, God, thank you for showing me the peace and stillness that I find in recovery. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Justin.
Thanks, Blake. Man, I really appreciate your share there. A lot of vulnerability, a lot of real emotion there, and just great. I'm very grateful for that. Now, Blake, before we get into the questions and further conversation back and forth here about your topic and about your own journey in recovery, would you mind taking about 60 seconds or so and sharing about the fellowship you belong to and why you found that helpful in your own recovery journey?
Yeah. So, you know, I had done a group therapy, and when we were finished, they said, go find a 12-step program. And one of the guys in the group had been attending an SAL step study meeting. And so he brought me to the SAL meeting, and I attended that for a couple years, and I stopped attending it. And I didn't work the steps, and because I thought I'd already worked the steps in my therapy. At least that's what story I told myself. Well, when I fell off the wagon, and I mean I went deep, and my sex addiction took hold. By the grace of God's hand, he led me back to the 12-step program. And when I came back, I started working the steps. And when I started working the steps, that's when I found recovery. And so I attend several SAL meetings a week. And many of you have heard me before, but to me, if you're not writing something down, you're not working a step. You're studying a step, you're thinking about a step, but you ain't working a step. You're not working a step until you take a piece of paper and a pencil and you start writing about it.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that, Blake. It's now time for Blake to answer questions that come in. I have a couple here written. And if you in the audience, reminder, if you have questions, type them in the Q&A link at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we'll relay those to Blake and have him answer questions for the next 20, 25 minutes or so, or until the questions are done. Blake, you just mentioned there about you're doing step work. And thinking that, you know, whether reading through the steps or going to a therapy group or something like that, thinking that, hey, I've worked the steps, I'm finding some semblance of peace or abstinence in my own experience here. Tell me a little bit more about the difference between reading the steps, going to a meeting once a week, putting the book back on the shelf and feeling good about it, and then coming back a week later and actually doing the work?
For me, it's been really amazing to start writing something. And it doesn't have to be, it just, you just answer the questions that are in any of the books. Any of the recovery books will ask you questions, and you can think about those questions. Okay, great. But when you start writing those questions down, it becomes real. And when I start writing, it's amazing how it changes, how God just changes what I put on the paper. And so there's been so many instances where I start writing, and I end up with something completely different. And it's very healing. Writing is very healing process to overcome a lot of the traumas that we face. And I think we have to overcome those before we can love ourselves and forgive ourselves. And that's an important part of recovery right there.
All right. Thank you, Blake. I agree 100%. And I also have found in that process of writing, then when I go back and I read it out loud to my sponsor, it hits me again in a different way and in a different manner. That writing concept and reviewing it has made a big difference in my own walk here in recovery. Another question that I have for you is basically from what you shared early on in this meeting. It was a very minor small thing, ding in a wall that started this shame cycle. How come you think that is, that we as humans, and maybe specifically addicts, but I think it's more human, have these small things, pivotal moments in our life where if a reaction could have been different, our whole life could have swung in a different way? Why do you think there's importance in those small things?
I wish I could answer that. All I know is that, when we look back at alcoholics and we read the big book and we realize that genetically, that there are families that have had these tendencies for generations. And it also doesn't take but just a small thing to change the course of the future generations.
Yeah. And I think Blake, what you shared there from your son, your stepson, who's your adopted son now, those small things have made a big difference in his life. And I think is it because you're more aware of the small hinge pin moments that can make a big difference? Is that why you think?
Realizing that I wasn't in recovery for a lot of those years. But I wanted them to be heard. And so I didn't want the judgment that I'd felt all my life. And so it was really important to me to be non-judgmental to my kids. Because if we can't have an honest conversation about drugs and alcohol and sex, and they can't feel safe bringing that up, then they will be an addict one day, or there's a high likelihood that they will be an addict. And it's much more important for me to make sure that they know that they can tell me anything and I'm not going to judge them. It's not my place to judge them. It's, I'll be there for them and I'll help them. But I just want them to know that they can have somebody to talk about, and that's way more important. It's probably the most important thing, is knowing that there's somebody there that they can talk about, so that they don't have to hold that in themselves. And I think there's too much of that in religion. Right now, you got to be perfect. How you have to be perfect. That's all we talk about is how to be perfect in religion. Well, if you screw up, do you want to talk about it? And you have to leave space for that with your kids because they're not going to be perfect. And I'm not perfect. And I have to leave. And that's hard for me to go to my wife and say, I screwed up. Nobody likes that conversation. At least I don't know many people that do, but it's freeing. And it takes a lot of practice to get there.
No, very good. I really appreciate that. We had a question come in from Sal. Thank you for your vulnerability, Blake. How were you able to change your view of God as being like your father to God being a loving, caring being?
So working step 2, when you place all of those traits from the authority figure and you realize that you've put them all on God, and realize that that's not God, and then having and getting to define your own God, which is wonderful. But if we're not vulnerable with our wives, if we're not vulnerable with somebody, if we're not vulnerable in the group, how can you ever feel compassion? And if you've never felt compassion, how can you put that trait on God? Because honestly, until I'd felt compassion, deep compassion from my wife, which happened probably for the first time in my life, maybe a year and a half ago, when I felt that compassion that she had for me, and I realized how much more compassion God must have for us. As that's, and defining God is wonderful. Let your kids define God. Have that conversation with them. They know best friend. They know those terms. That's something they can understand. God's your best friend. What do you want to tell your best friend? Does your best friend judge you? Does your best friend love you? And as they get older, they can develop those, and as they learn other, words of sympathy and empathy and love, they can then put those on God. But I think it's a journey. I think learning what God can do is a journey.
Oh, that's really powerful. I enjoy that. And I've heard it said before and mentioned before from others and myself. I say it myself too, is that in step 2, I eventually had to fire the old God of my understanding and hire the new God of my understanding. Does that ring true to you also? Is that an experience that you think you went through with that?
Absolutely. That's why I have to refer to him as God right now. Like when I refer to him as Heavenly Father, it just brings back all of those traits from growing up, because that was my God growing up. And I love the fact that I think he just wants to hear from us. I don't think he cares what we call him. I think he just wants us to reach out.
So I have a follow-up question on that. Much of my life, I felt that when I was calling out to the God of my understanding, my words were bouncing off the walls and ceilings and weren't getting anywhere. Did you have an experience perhaps where you recognized, holy cow, these words are getting through to this being who actually cares about me, that you'd like to share with us?
Step 3. And I don't fully understand it to this day. But if you want to feel God, you surrender one day. Surrender to God. And it doesn't have to be complicated. It just has to be, God, this addiction's bigger than I am, and I need you to take it. And he will answer. And when he does, you're like, wow, that's the first time in my life that I felt like God heard me. He's there. And that's amazing. That is absolutely amazing.
Yeah. No, thank you for sharing that also. Before we get to this next question, if anybody else in the listening audience has any more questions, please type them in the Q&A link, and we'll get to that. But until then, here's another question on that. So Blake, as you have worked with other people who are walking this path, other recovering addicts, how do you explain to them kind of the same thing here as they're working through their own concept of God, or how do you help them walk through that exercise of finding out who God is?
A lot of it's just putting your pencil on the paper and writing down. I mean, if you're going to reach out to God, you might as well define him as somebody you can reach out to. So wipe away the slate and start putting things that you want on God. And if it's only a couple, that's great. Whatever it is, you start small, but just, find a God that you can reach out to. Because if you can't reach out to him, then you haven't done a very good job of defining him. You gotta make him real enough and understanding enough that you want to reach out to him. And lately that image of God holding a 5-year-old kid saying, "You're enough." And imagining now when I screw up and God holding me saying, "You're enough," it just keeps me going.
That is a beautiful image. All right. So Blake, before we close up, do you have any final words of wisdom to share with the listening audience here?
Oh man, I could go on for days, but not really, because that's another 20 minutes. So, if I ever come back, we'll talk about, I call it fuzzy bubbles. And if you've ever taken a scoop of ice cream and poured warm root beer on it, you get fuzzy bubbles, and you don't ever get root beer. And if you don't take the time to work your recovery, and you don't take the time to talk and listen to God, all you're going to get is fuzzy bubbles, and you're never going to get any root beer.
That is awesome. I look forward to talking to you further about that at some point and learning more about that. I love that imagery and the truth behind it. Thank you so much, Blake. That was a great RECO12 weekly speaker meeting for all addicts and those wanting to learn more about addiction and the recovery therefrom. If you have any other questions that you'd like to ask and pose to Blake or to anybody else in the forum, please go to RECO12.com/forum and join in our community and ask those questions and answer others' questions that will come up. I invite the audience to come back next week. If you've not yet gone to RECO12.com and submitted your email address, you only need to do it once and you'll get those emails every week. Please get on the invitation list so that you can join us live each Friday at noon Central Time. Blake has asked that we do the third step prayer to launch off into the rest of the day. So if you'd like to join me now in that, feel free to do so. God, I offer myself to thee, to build with me and to do with me as thou wilt. Relieve me of the bondage of self, that I may better do thy will. Take away my difficulties, that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help of thy power, thy love, and thy way of life. May I do thy will always. Amen. Thanks again, Blake, and thank you everybody for your participation. We'll see y'all next week.
Standing still a moment, carving out this time, reflecting on the landscape of this life of mine. Peaks too high to conquer, streams too wide to cross, troughs too deep to walk through without incurring loss. Yet here I am. survive the storms and walk through wind and rain. Still standing, I will fight the good fight. Still searching for glimmers of light. Feet still on the ground. I can still be found standing still.
My wings are torn and tattered, but I know I still can fly. I may not soar unfettered, I may not rise too high.
Record it in the book of life and bind it with a seal that I am bowed and broken. I am standing still.
Only God knows where the path of life will yet lead me. I do not even ask to know. I do not need to see.
It is enough to know that I'm loved and not alone.